It's funny how life has a way of surprising you. One moment, everything seems normal, predictable even, and the next, something unexpected shifts your entire perspective. I never imagined my life taking the turn it did, but now that I look back, I can't help but wonder if I allowed myself to get too close to something I should have avoided. Before diving into this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales that keep you on the edge of your seat. It all began on a quiet evening. I was curled up in the living room with a book when I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. My stepson, Dylan, stood there, his expression slightly uneasy. Dylan wasn't one to ask for help often, so his appearance caught me off guard. "Hey, can you help me with something?" he asked, his tone tentative. I nodded, putting my book aside. "Sure, come in. What do you need?" He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "It's my belt," he said, holding it up slightly. "I can't get it to fit right." At first I thought nothing of it. It seemed like such a simple, mundane request. Dylan wasn't a teenager anymore. He was in his early 20s, practically an adult. Still, there was something about the way he was acting that felt off. His casual demeanor seemed a little too forced, and the way his eyes lingered on me made me feel oddly self-conscious. "Okay, let me take a look," I said, moving closer to him. As I reached for his belt, his pants shifted slightly, revealing a brief sliver of vulnerability that startled me more than it should have. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a small, fleeting moment, but it was enough to make me freeze. My fingers hovered in place as my heart inexplicably began to race, the steady rhythm betraying my outward composure. When I finally dared to look up, I caught his gaze. What I saw there was different, a tension, a spark that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the typical casual glance he often gave. This was loaded, searching, as though he were seeing me in an entirely new light. The playful, laid-back attitude I associated with him had vanished, replaced by a quiet intensity that unsettled me deeply. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, thick with something unspoken, something that neither of us seemed ready to acknowledge. I wanted to step back, to break the moment, but instead, I stood there, my hands hovering for just a second too long. "Thanks," Dylan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand brushed against mine as he stepped back, and the contact sent a strange jolt through me. "No problem," I managed to say, forcing a casual tone. But something about that moment lingered. It felt like an unspoken secret between us, one neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. Dylan seemed to be around more often, his presence almost deliberate. He'd pop up unexpectedly, his tone casual but his eyes, watching me, studying me. It made me uneasy, but I tried to brush it off as my imagination. One evening, I was in the kitchen finishing dinner when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I expected to see my husband, but it was Dylan again. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" he asked, his voice strained. I set the dish down and wiped my hands. "What's up?" He hesitated, glancing around as though ensuring we were alone. "I just wanted to say thanks. For the other day. With the belt, I mean." My stomach tightened at the mention of it. I had been trying to forget about that moment, to push it out of my mind. But now, here it was again, hanging between us. "It's no big deal," I said quickly, trying to sound nonchalant. "You don't have to. I just don't want you to feel weird about it," he interrupted, his words coming out in a rush. "I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was weird, but it felt like we were close. Closer than I expected." I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. There was something in his tone, something that felt like he was testing me, pushing boundaries. "Dylan, you're overthinking it," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "Maybe," he replied, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Or maybe not." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I felt my face flush as I turned away, desperate to break the tension, But deep down, I knew the point was I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. Dylan, don't worry about it. I'm not uncomfortable. It was just a small thing, nothing more. But as I said the words, I couldn't help but feel a little off. I wanted to believe him, to brush it aside like I'd done before. But this time, I wasn't so sure. There was something unspoken between us, something that had shifted and lingered in the air after that first incident. And for some reason, I couldn't let it go. "Okay," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. "I'm glad. I just didn't want to make things weird between us." I nodded, but inside, I couldn't help but feel like things were getting weird, almost uncomfortably so. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of what had happened earlier pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I tried desperately to push the thoughts out of my mind, focusing on anything else, but they clung to me, persistent and unrelenting. The look in his eyes, that piercing, searching gaze, kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't the look of someone who had simply made a mistake. It carried a kind of intention, as though he were probing, testing the waters, gauging my reaction to see just how far he could go without stepping over some unspoken line. And the worst part? Maybe, just maybe, I was too willing to let him. My own hesitation, the way I had frozen instead of pulling away, betrayed me in ways I wasn't ready to admit even to myself. The days passed, and the tension between Dylan and me continued to build, like a storm brewing in the distance. Every time I saw him, there was this weight in the air. I could feel it. He would smile at me, but it was different. There was something behind it, something hidden. He was being careful, almost as if he knew how close he was getting to crossing some invisible line. And I was starting to feel it too. The line between what was appropriate and what wasn't was becoming blurrier by the day. One evening, my husband was out of town for a business trip, and I was home alone with Dylan. It wasn't unusual for us to be in the house together, but there was always this unspoken rule about keeping things normal, keeping things safe. But with each passing day, I felt like that normalcy was slipping through my fingers. I was sitting in the living room watching TV when Dylan walked in. He was holding a book, but his eyes weren't on it. They were on me. "Hey," he said, sitting down on the couch next to me. His body was closer than it usually was. It wasn't just a casual seat anymore. It felt intentional. "Hi," I said, not looking at him, trying to focus on the show. But I could feel him. I could feel his presence beside me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Is it okay if I ask you something?" he said quietly. His voice sounded different this time, more serious, more deliberate. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge his expression. "Sure, what's up?" He shifted, looking uncomfortable. I don't know if I should be asking this, but I've been thinking about something that happened before." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I knew exactly what he was referring to. The belt incident. That damn belt. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want you to think I'm weird or anything, but ever since that day, I don't know. It's like I can't stop thinking about it. About you." He paused, his eyes locking with mine. "You make me feel safe. You make me feel like I can talk to you about stuff. I don't know if that makes sense." His words hung in the air, and I felt like the room had just gotten 10 degrees hotter. My heart raced, my thoughts were scrambled, and I had no idea what to say. This wasn't just about a belt anymore. This wasn't just about him asking for help. He was saying things that were crossing a line, not in a physical way, but emotionally, mentally. I tried to laugh it off, to make it seem like he was just being dramatic. "Dylan, you're overthinking this. It was nothing, really." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Because at that moment, it was something. It was more than I was willing to admit, more than I was ready to face. He leaned in a little closer, and I could smell his cologne. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with confusion. What was he doing? Why was he acting like this? I know it's probably crazy, he said, his voice soft and low, but I feel like we have a connection, like maybe we're more alike than you think, and I don't want to feel guilty about it. I just want to know you better. His words were like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. I had to pull away. I had to put some distance between us. Dylan, I said, my voice trembling. We can't. This isn't something we can talk about. It's not right. He immediately backed off, looking like he regretted what he had said. Sorry, I didn't mean to make things weird. But it was already too late. The damage was done. The line had been crossed, and I pretended like nothing had happened. I couldn't pretend that I wasn't feeling something too. I stood up, trying to regain my composure. I think you should go to bed. He nodded silently, standing up as well, but his eyes never left mine. And as he walked away, I realized something. This was the moment when everything changed. There was no turning back now. The lines had blurred, and I didn't know where this was headed, but I knew it was a dangerous path to follow. The next day, things were quiet between Dylan and me. The words we'd exchanged the night before hung between us like an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to address. I didn't want to confront him, and I sure as hell didn't want to admit that everything had changed. But I could feel it, like an invisible wall had gone up between us, one that neither of us was willing to break down. I went about my usual routine, trying to keep my mind off everything. I kept myself busy, focusing on the small things to distract myself from the lingering feelings of guilt and confusion. But Dylan wasn't making it easy. It wasn't just what he'd said. It was the way he'd looked at me. Every time I saw him, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite put into words. And every time our eyes met, it was like an electric current ran through me. But then, as the days went by, Dylan started acting distant. He avoided me, like he was ashamed of what had happened. It was almost like he was trying to pretend it hadn't occurred, like he didn't feel what he'd said the night before. He was cold, distant, and it felt like a slap in the face. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed again. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the warm weather, when I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. It was Dylan. He stood there for a moment, his hands stuffed in his pockets, staring at the ground like he was weighing his options. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I put down my book and nodded, unsure of what he wanted. He sat down next to me, leaving a comfortable amount of space between us. It was awkward, and I could feel the tension building in the air. Neither of us knew what to say next. I've been thinking about what happened," he began, looking down at his hands. "And I know I messed up. I shouldn't have said all that stuff. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. I never meant to do that." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Dylan, I don't know what you want me to say. It's complicated. What you said, it crossed a line, and I don't know how to go back from that." He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I get it. I don't know why I said that. I guess I was just confused, and I didn't want to hide how I felt. But I realize now that it was wrong." I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Relief because he was acknowledging what had happened, but confused because I still didn't know how to feel about it. I couldn't just brush it off as if nothing had changed. Something had shifted. Something that felt real. Something that felt dangerous. We sat there in silence for a while, neither of us knowing how to fill the space between us. Finally, Dylan spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't want things to be weird between us. I don't want to lose whatever this is." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The way he said it was so vulnerable, so unsure, made me want to reach out, to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Everything wasn't fine, and it wouldn't be fine. I stood up, suddenly needing to put some distance between us. "I think we need some time." "We both do." Dylan stood up too, looking like he wanted to say more but didn't know how. Okay, I understand. I hope things don't stay weird. I turned away, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know if this was the end of it, or if we were both just trying to pretend that everything was normal when it wasn't. But one thing was for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks after that conversation felt like walking on eggshells. Dylan and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was like we were both trying too hard to keep things casual, pretending that everything was fine when I knew deep down it wasn't. The distance between us grew, and with it, the awkwardness that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. But then one night, everything was away on another business trip, and I was home alone. It wasn't unusual, but this time, Dylan was acting differently. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something. I didn't know what, but the tension between us was palpable. I was in the kitchen making dinner when Dylan walked in. This time, he didn't hesitate. He just stood in the doorway watching me. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice almost urgent. I stopped what I was doing, my heart skipping a beat. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I was ready to have this conversation again. "What about?" He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "I need to get something off my chest." My pulse quickened, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. The last time he had said something like that, everything had spiraled out of control. Was this going to be the same? "I've been thinking about us," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "About everything that happened. And I know you're probably tired of hearing me talk about it, but I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught in my throat. "Dylan, no." But he cut me off. "Please, just hear me out. I don't know what this is, but it's more than I can ignore. And I know it's messed up. I know we shouldn't be having this conversation, but I can't help it." He stepped closer, and I felt my body freeze. He wasn't just standing there now. He was in my space, his presence overwhelming. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms sweating. I wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave, but part of me couldn't move. Part of me didn't want to. "I know this is wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop thinking about the way we've been connected, the way I've felt around you, and I need to know if you feel the same way, if you've thought about it even once." I didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in my throat, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to be real. But here he was, standing in front of me, his eyes full of something I couldn't deny, something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. I stepped back, shaking my head. "Dylan, stop. This isn't what you think. It's not right." But he wasn't listening. His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and for a brief moment I felt a jolt of electricity pass between us. "I'm not going to stop," he said softly, his voice full of conviction. "And I don't want you to stop either. I can't pretend like nothing's happening anymore." My heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the pull between us, a gravity I couldn't escape. But I also knew what it would mean if I let it happen. I knew the consequences, the pain, the heartbreak. I pulled away more forcefully this time. "No, Dylan, this can't happen." He stepped back, his face falling, but there was no mistaking the frustration in his eyes. "I don't want to lose you, okay? I don't want to pretend anymore." I stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of his words settle in the pit of my stomach. I didn't know what to do, what to feel. All I knew was that the line had been crossed again, and now I had to decide which way to go. But in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about Dylan and me. It was about the choices I made, the boundaries I set or didn't set. It was about who I wanted to be and who I wanted to become, and as I walked away, my heart heavy with uncertainty, I knew that this story wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the days stretched into weeks, I found myself caught in a constant state of reflection. Each moment with Dylan, every word exchanged, seemed to echo in my mind. I knew the lines we had crossed could not simply be redrawn, but I also knew that our paths were tangled now in ways I couldn't ignore. The future was uncertain, and the weight of my decisions loomed heavily over me. But in the quiet moments of solitude, one thought persisted. No matter how dangerous the path ahead, it was one I could no longer avoid. The choice was mine, and I had to face it.